So the next sub-lesson is I want to actually compare FreeBSD with Linux because this is something that just gets asked all the time. And the biggest place that there's a difference is in the licensing, because the operating systems themselves have to meet the standards for what's essentially the Unix interface, and an application that will run on Linux will run on FreeBSD. In fact, FreeBSD has a Linux emulation mode, so you can literally take a binary that was compiled and built on Linux, drop it onto a FreeBSD machine, and just run it, and it will work. So the places where you see a really significant difference is in the licensing of the two different systems. To understand this, you have to talk a little bit about copyright. So let's start with the traditional copyright, which is used by closed source for the most part. The source code is usually not available. If it is available, it's available in very restricted ways. You may be allowed to look at it, but not to change it, or often it just isn't available. So if you are getting something like Windows, you just get the Windows binary. You don't have the option of looking at the source code. If you don't understand how it works, you just have to keep sort of writing little programs to probe at it till you can figure it out. So the licensing for open source projects typically is not going to use the traditional copyright. So let's start with the GNU copyleft, which is the type of copyright that is used by Linux. There are actually two different versions of it. There is what's called the GNU Public License version 2, and this is what the Linux kernel itself uses. With anything that has the GPL2, you must make the source available, including any of your own work. So if you go in and you have a product and your IP is actually compiled in as part of the kernel, you are required to make the source code for your IP available. Now, if you have your IP above the Linux kernel, so you just have the Linux kernel doing its thing, and you have a separate program that just runs on Linux, then the fact that Linux is GPL2 does not affect you. You can put a traditional copyright on your program and not have to give the source code away. A few years ago, the GNU copyleft was switched from the GNU Public License 2 to GNU Public License 3, and GNU Public License 3 has many of the same properties of GNU Public License 2, but it also adds that if you have any patents of yours that cover stuff that's in your open source code, you must provide a no-cost license to use those patents. This has caused a certain amount of concern among the folks that do open source and have their products or their intellectual property in something that's GPL3, because with GPL2 they could make the source code available, but if somebody actually used it, they could then come after them and get them to pay patenting fees. With GPL3, that's not the case. Now, the Linux kernel is still on GPL2, so does not have that issue, but much of the surrounding code that's packaged around Linux, so the GCC compiler, the libraries, etc., are in fact using GPL3. And so as soon as you start pulling any of that into your product, you do run the risk of being forced to give away your source code and the patents that run with it. As I've already said, a lot of FreeBSD ends up being used by people that need to put their intellectual property into the kernel. So Juniper, for example, all their routing IP is in the operating system itself. And so using Linux would be a non-starter for them because they would have to give that away. So this then brings us to the Berkeley style. It's neither copyleft nor copyright. We like to refer to it as copy center, which is you can take it down to the copy center and make as many copies as you want and do whatever you want with it. Have a good life. You do not have to provide the source code. You do not have to provide the patent rights. You can, in fact, lock it up tight as a drum, and it's your own proprietary product. The complaint, of course, that's usually put against using the Berkeley style copyright is that you don't get all of this work fed back into the system as you do with the copyleft. And in fact, that's often initially true. Companies will grab FreeBSD, they will run off, they will do their own thing, they will not give anything back. But at some point they find that they need to upgrade to the next version of the system in order to get some features that weren't available in the earlier version. And what they discover is that it's a tremendous amount of work to move all of their source code over to the new system. And in fact, they discover that there's huge amounts of stuff where they need to rewrite a bunch of stuff that really is not part of their intellectual property. It's just really part of the operating system, and it's just a huge amount of work. And they discover, if we had simply given that little bit back, that bug fix back, then it would have just been in the system and somebody else would have maintained it for us and we wouldn't have to do that. And so after they do their first upgrade, typically what happens is that some changes start trickling back into BSD. And then when they do their second upgrade, they discover, it was really good that we did that, but boy, we could do that with a whole lot more stuff. And so a bunch more fixes start coming into the system. And in fact, that's about the time that they make sure that they have a committer or two on their staff to ease the path of being able to get stuff into the main system. I mean, committers can't just randomly drop anything they want in there. They still have to go through an approval process, etc., review process at any rate. But it still greases the wheel if you have someone who's a committer and understands the way things work. And by about the third update, that we find that they're trying to push so much stuff, it's like, really, that's your proprietary stuff. You probably don't actually want to put that back into the system here. So given about a 5-year lag of usage, we find that we're getting more or less the same amount of useful information back into FreeBSD that the GNU folks are getting fed back into Linux. And in fact, the fact that people can doesn't mean that they necessarily will just run off with it and not provide any other feedback. There's various distribution options for getting FreeBSD. First of all, if we look at the desktop, this is one where Linux has spent a great deal more effort. And as one of the other committers likes to say, why come up with a good idea when you can steal a better one? And so the desktop for FreeBSD is built on the desktops that are used for Linux. KDE or whatever your favorite desktop system is available. Now you can build it all yourself out of ports, but that's a lot of work. And so there's a group called FreeBSD that has essentially gone through and taken FreeBSD and gone through all of the ports and said, there's about 50 of these ports that are really useful for desktop applications. So they picked the sort of 3 most popular of the desktops, and they've picked the 3 most popular browsers, and they've picked the 3 most popular email systems. And so you can just get FreeBSD, drop it in. You can do a live boot off of it just to see what it's like. And you just sort of go through and configure, I want that desktop and that browser and that mail system, and it just puts them in there. And they have a little automatic upgrade thing, so it'll come and tell you, oh, Firefox has a new update. Do you want it installed? Yes, no. So you don't really have to think about keeping on top of all the ports that you're using. And so if you want to do a desktop system, I recommend you just get FreeBSD and go from there. Note that FreeBSD is not a fork of FreeBSD. Every new release of FreeBSD is based on the current release of FreeBSD and the ports from FreeBSD. It's just a packaging of the FreeBSD system to make it more convenient to work on a desktop. The other, of course, is server, and this is typically where you are going to either want to run FreeBSD in a cloud instance, in which case you're going to want to grab one of the packages that's designed for doing that, or you want to run it on bare metal. And in this case, you probably will want to run the stock FreeBSD distribution. There are a number of them that are tailored for different purposes. So there is PicoBSD, which has had pretty much everything stripped out of it so that it has a very, very small footprint. And then you just add back in what you need. So if you need a file system, you add a file system. If you need the networking, you add the networking, and so on. But it will run on a small embedded flash kind of thing. There, at the opposite extreme, is the full generic FreeBSD distribution that has everything in there, all the different file systems, all the different networking stacks, etc., and is ready to roll on as big a system as you want to drop it onto. That you would get from the FreeBSD organization itself. If you go there, you can see you can get current, and you can get the various different stable releases and so on. Then beyond that base distribution, you just pull in from ports the things you need. So if you need the Apache web server, you can bring that in. If you're doing name server stuff, or you need LDAP or whatever, you can just, again, bring in the bits and pieces that you need from the ports tree. Finally, there's commercial support available. So if you've got a system and you need to have somebody that you can call, a company called IX Systems, and they are happy to provide hardware, their software, consulting, how to get the thing working, whatever you need.